The conference table was crowded with uniforms, stars, ribbons, decades of distinguished service records. She sat quietly at the far end, the only woman in the room, largely ignored as the senior officers spoke over one another about strategic options and tactical assessments. But when the satellite surveillance feed suddenly failed and tension filled the briefing room, General Morrison paused mid-sentence and looked directly at her. "Captain Williams, what do you see?" he asked. She answered clearly and confidently, laying out a comprehensive strategy that no one else had considered, identifying blind spots in their intelligence and proposing solutions that addressed every concern raised in the previous hour. The room went completely silent. Then heads began to nod slowly, one by one. And just like that, the officer they hadn't even planned to consult became the strategic voice that would guide the entire operation. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories about brilliant minds breaking through barriers and proving that the best ideas often come from unexpected sources, consider subscribing for more content that celebrates the moments when expertise transcends expectations. The polished mahogany conference table reflected the soft overhead lighting in the Pentagon's secure briefing room as Captain Sarah Williams arranged her classified files at position 12, the seat furthest from the head of the table. At 1,400 hours, the Joint Chiefs Emergency Strategic Session was about to begin, with senior officers filing into the room carrying the weight of a developing crisis in Eastern Europe that threatened to escalate into the most serious confrontation between superpowers since the end of the Cold War. Williams moved with quiet efficiency, her briefcase containing intelligence assessments that few in the room had been cleared to review, as she took her assigned seat among men whose careers spanned decades of command experience and whose decisions had shaped military policy for generations. The briefing room itself was a testament to military power and strategic decision-making. Walls lined with secure communication equipment capable of connecting to any military installation worldwide. Multiple display screens that could show real-time intelligence from satellites, drones, and ground sensors across the globe. And a conference table that had witnessed decisions affecting millions of lives throughout its decades of service in the highest levels of American military leadership. The room's design reflected the gravity of the decisions made within its walls, with sound-dampening materials ensuring that conversations could not be overheard outside, while electromagnetic shielding prevented any electronic surveillance of the proceedings. Every chair around the table had been occupied by officers who had commanded forces in combat, made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, and carried the responsibility for American military operations in the most dangerous regions of the world. The accumulated experience in the room represented centuries of military service, multiple wars, and strategic decisions that had influenced the course of international relations for decades. "Gentlemen, let's begin," announced General Robert Morrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his voice carrying the authority of 35 years of military leadership as he surveyed the assembled officers. The general's opening statement reflected the traditional assumption that strategic decision-making remained primarily a male domain, despite gradual changes in military leadership structure and the increasing presence of women in senior military positions throughout the armed forces. Williams straightened slightly, though she noted that Morrison's opening address hadn't acknowledged her presence among the 12 officers assembled for this critical assessment. The exclusion was subtle but characteristic of the challenges faced by women in senior military positions, where their expertise was often overlooked in favor of more traditional leadership voices that reflected decades of established military culture. The briefing concerned Russian military buildup along NATO borders, a situation requiring immediate strategic assessment and potential military response options that could escalate into the most serious confrontation between superpowers since the end of the Cold War. Intelligence reports indicated that Russian forces had been massing along the borders of several NATO member states, creating a crisis that required careful analysis and measured response to prevent miscalculation that could lead to armed conflict with global implications. Intelligence Overview, General Patterson, Morrison continued, directing attention to the Defense Intelligence Agency representative whose assessment would form the foundation for all subsequent strategic decisions made by the Joint Chiefs and ultimately presented to the President and Secretary of Defense for consideration at the highest levels of government. General Patterson activated the wall-mounted displays, showing satellite imagery of Russian force concentrations that had been gathering for the past 72 hours in patterns that suggested either large-scale military exercises or preparation for actual military operations targeting NATO infrastructure and territory. Current assessment indicates 3 motor rifle divisions moved into position over the past 72 hours. Intent remains unclear, but positioning suggests either large-scale exercises or preparation for cross-border operations targeting NATO member states. The satellite imagery showed thousands of military vehicles, artillery systems, and support equipment positioned in areas that provided multiple options for rapid deployment across international borders. The scale of the buildup was unprecedented in recent years and suggested a level of military preparation that could not be explained by routine exercises or defensive positioning designed to protect Russian territory from perceived threats. Admiral Catherine Hayes, the only other woman in senior leadership and someone Williams greatly respected for her pioneering career in naval intelligence and operations, leaned forward to contribute her assessment from maritime intelligence sources. Naval intelligence confirms increased submarine activity in the Baltic Sea. Pattern suggests coordination with ground force movements and possible preparation for naval blockade operations that could disrupt NATO supply lines and commercial shipping. The naval intelligence assessment added another dimension to the crisis, suggesting that Russian intentions might extend beyond ground operations to include control of critical maritime routes that connected NATO member states and supported the alliance's ability to coordinate responses to threats and maintain economic relationships that underpinned collective security arrangements. The discussion that followed was intense and focused, with each service chief contributing assessments from their respective intelligence networks that had been monitoring Russian activities for weeks using satellite surveillance, electronic intelligence gathering, and human intelligence sources throughout the region. Williams listened carefully, noting discrepancies between different intelligence sources that others seemed to overlook in their rush to develop response strategies that would demonstrate NATO resolve while avoiding escalation to armed conflict. Air Force perspective? Morrison asked, turning to General Michael Chun, whose air intelligence networks had been monitoring Russian aviation activity across Eastern Europe using both satellite surveillance and electronic intelligence gathering that tracked communication patterns and radar emissions associated with military flight operations. Satellite reconnaissance shows airfield activity consistent with combat preparation. However, we're seeing mixed signals. Some units appear to be conducting routine maintenance, while others are clearly in deployment configuration for immediate operational status. The pattern is inconsistent with either full-scale combat preparation or routine training exercises. Williams had been analyzing these same satellite feeds for weeks, but from a different angle than the traditional military assessment approach that focused primarily on threat indicators and capability analysis. Her background in systems analysis and pattern recognition had revealed details that standard intelligence evaluation might miss when viewed through conventional strategic frameworks that emphasized immediate threats rather than underlying patterns and motivations. Her analysis had identified subtle inconsistencies in the Russian activities that suggested a different purpose than either combat preparation or routine exercises. The timing of various activities, the types of equipment being deployed, and the communication patterns associated with the buildup all indicated something more complex than traditional threat assessment had identified. As the discussion continued, Williams observed that each service was interpreting the intelligence through the lens of their own operational perspective and institutional priorities. The Army focused on ground force movements and their implications for land-based operations. The Navy concentrated on maritime activity and its impact on sea-based strategy, and the Air Force emphasized aviation assets and their role in air superiority operations. But no one was synthesizing these separate observations into a comprehensive understanding of Russian intentions that might reveal a completely different scenario than the one being assumed by traditional threat assessment methodologies. This fragmented approach to intelligence analysis was characteristic of bureaucratic decision-making, where institutional perspectives and established analytical frameworks often prevented the kind of comprehensive understanding that could reveal alternative explanations for observed activities. Williams recognized that her outsider perspective might allow her to see patterns that were invisible to officers whose thinking was shaped by decades of conventional military analysis. Recommendations for response options? Morrison asked the assembled officers, expecting the standard military responses that had guided American strategic thinking for decades and reflected established doctrines for responding to apparent threats from potential adversaries. General Patterson spoke first, presenting recommendations that reflected conventional military thinking and established protocols for responding to apparent threats. Recommend immediate NATO consultation and positioning of rapid response forces along alliance borders to demonstrate resolve and deter potential Russian aggression while maintaining alliance unity and commitment to collective defense. Admiral Hayes nodded agreement, adding her perspective from naval operations and maritime strategy. Concurrent naval deployments to demonstrate resolve and provide strategic deterrence while maintaining freedom of navigation in international waters and ensuring NATO's ability to maintain communications and supply lines between member states. General Chun added the air component to the proposed response, reflecting Air Force doctrine and capabilities. Enhanced air patrols and intelligence surveillance to monitor further developments and provide early warning of any escalatory actions while demonstrating NATO's air superiority capabilities and readiness to respond to threats. Morrison surveyed the room, preparing to formalize recommendations that would be presented to civilian leadership and could influence American foreign policy for years to come. Any additional perspectives before we formalize recommendations to present to the President and Secretary of Defense? Williams hesitated, recognizing that protocol suggested junior officers should speak only when directly invited, and her presence at this meeting was primarily as an intelligence specialist rather than a strategic advisor with the authority to influence major policy decisions. But the analysis she'd been developing painted a picture significantly different from the assessments being discussed, and she recognized that this might be the only opportunity to present an alternative perspective that could fundamentally change how the crisis was understood and addressed. The moment represented a critical decision point in her career. Speaking up could be seen as overstepping her role and challenging the judgment of far more senior officers with decades of experience. But remaining silent meant allowing decisions to be made based on what she believed was incomplete understanding of the situation. Before she could decide whether to speak, the primary satellite feed display went dark, plunging the room into an unexpected technical crisis that threatened to disrupt the entire strategic assessment process. Technical failure, announced the communications officer monitoring the feeds from a console at the rear of the briefing room. Primary surveillance satellite experiencing signal interruption. Could be equipment malfunction or possible electronic interference from hostile sources attempting to blind our intelligence capabilities. Morrison's expression hardened as he recognized the implications of losing critical intelligence capability during a strategic crisis that required real-time information to make informed decisions. How long for restoration? Unknown, sir. Could be equipment failure requiring physical repair or possible electronic warfare interference that would require different countermeasures. Secondary satellites have limited coverage from optimal angles needed for detailed assessment of Russian force positions. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. During a critical intelligence gathering phase, their primary surveillance capability had failed exactly when they needed it most to monitor Russian activities and verify current assessments that formed the foundation for strategic decision-making. Secondary surveillance assets. Patterson asked, recognizing that degraded intelligence could lead to miscalculations with catastrophic consequences if strategic decisions were based on incomplete or outdated information. Limited coverage from that angle. We'll have degraded intelligence until primary restoration, possibly forcing strategic decisions based on incomplete information that could lead to miscalculation or inadequate response to rapidly changing situation. Morrison looked around the table with growing frustration as he recognized the challenge facing the group. Gentlemen, we need strategic recommendations based on incomplete intelligence. This is exactly the kind of scenario where mistakes get made and miscalculations lead to unintended escalation or inadequate response to genuine threats. In the silence that followed, Williams realized this was the moment when different perspectives might be most valuable. The senior officers were focused on responding to Russian actions using conventional threat assessment frameworks, but Williams had identified patterns suggesting something entirely different might be occurring. Patterns that could change the entire strategic framework for understanding the situation and developing appropriate responses. "General Morrison," Williams said quietly, her voice steady despite the significance of the moment, "if I may offer an alternative analysis." Every head in the room turned toward her with varying degrees of surprise and skepticism. Morrison's expression was neutral but attentive, recognizing that Williams' intelligence background might provide insights that others had missed. "Captain Williams, proceed." Williams activated her tablet, which contained the comprehensive analysis she'd been developing using unconventional analytical methodologies that applied systems thinking and pattern recognition to strategic intelligence assessment. "Sir, I've been conducting detailed pattern analysis of Russian military activities over the past 6 months using systems analysis techniques rather than traditional threat assessment frameworks. The current movements don't match historical patterns for either large-scale exercises or preparation for offensive operations." She stood and moved to the display controls with the confidence of someone who had spent months developing detailed understanding of the situation through meticulous analysis. "If we examine the timing, positioning, and logistics patterns through systems analysis rather than traditional threat assessment, a completely different picture emerges." Williams uploaded her analysis to the main screens, replacing the failed satellite feed with comprehensive mapping that revealed details invisible in traditional intelligence assessment focused on immediate threat indicators rather than underlying patterns and systemic relationships. The wall displays now showed Williams' comprehensive mapping of Russian activities, with timeline overlays and predictive modeling that revealed details invisible in traditional intelligence assessment. Her analysis included not only military movements, but also economic indicators, diplomatic activities, communication patterns, and logistical considerations that provided a much more complete picture of Russian intentions and capabilities. "The troop movements everyone's been tracking appear threatening when viewed in isolation," Williams continued, her voice growing stronger as she presented analysis that represented months of detailed work. "But when we analyze them in context with supply chain activities, communication patterns, maintenance schedules, diplomatic initiatives, and economic considerations, they suggest something else entirely." General Patterson leaned forward with interest, recognizing that Williams was presenting analysis that went far beyond standard intelligence evaluation and represented a fundamentally different approach to understanding complex international situations. "Explain your assessment, Captain." Williams highlighted specific data points on her analysis, demonstrating the depth of research she had conducted independently using resources available through her intelligence clearance. "The units being moved are primarily older equipment and less experienced personnel. The elite divisions remain in their home bases with no preparation for sustained deployment or extended operations. Supply movements are consistent with exercise support rather than combat preparation, lacking the logistical infrastructure required for sustained offensive operations." Williams continued her analysis, highlighting patterns that had escaped notice in conventional threat assessment. Most significantly, the communication patterns show coordination with NATO early warning systems rather than attempts to avoid detection, and diplomatic channels remain open with continued discussion of arms control and regional security cooperation. Admiral Hayes studied the display with growing comprehension as the implications of Williams' analysis became clear. "You're suggesting this is an exercise designed to test NATO response capabilities rather than preparation for hostile action." "Exactly, ma'am. The Russians are conducting a sophisticated intelligence gathering operation designed to measure our response times, analyze our deployment patterns, assess our coordination procedures, and evaluate our decision-making processes under pressure. The apparent threat is actually an elaborate reconnaissance mission designed to gather strategic intelligence about NATO's defensive capabilities and command structures." The room was completely silent as the implications of Williams' analysis became clear. The crisis everyone had been preparing to respond to was actually a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation designed to observe exactly how NATO would respond to apparent threats, potentially gathering invaluable intelligence about American strategic thinking and military capabilities that could be used to plan future operations or develop countermeasures to NATO defensive strategies. General Chun was the first to speak, recognizing the strategic implications of Williams' assessment. Captain, if your analysis is correct, our proposed responses would provide the Russians with exactly the intelligence they're seeking about our capabilities, response procedures, and strategic thinking. Yes, sir. By deploying rapid response forces and increasing surveillance operations, we would be demonstrating our capabilities and revealing our strategic approach to exactly the scenario they're simulating. We would essentially be providing them with a detailed demonstration of our defensive strategies, command procedures, and coordination mechanisms. Morrison studied Williams' analysis more carefully, recognizing that she had identified patterns that had completely escaped traditional intelligence evaluation conducted by some of the most experienced analysts in American military intelligence. What evidence supports this assessment, Captain? Williams highlighted additional data on her displays, demonstrating the comprehensive nature of her research and the methodical approach she had taken to developing her conclusions. Communication intercepts show Russian forces coordinating with civilian air traffic control to avoid interference with commercial aviation, unusual for combat preparation, but standard for exercises designed to minimize civilian disruption. Logistics patterns indicate planned return to home bases within 2 weeks, inconsistent with sustained deployment for actual military operations. Williams paused before presenting her most significant observation. Most importantly, the satellite failure we just experienced occurred at exactly the moment when our assessment meeting was scheduled to begin, according to information that should have been available only to personnel with access to the highest levels of operational planning. This last observation sent a chill through the room. The timing of the satellite disruption was too convenient to be coincidental, suggesting Russian intelligence capabilities far more sophisticated than anyone had assumed, and raising questions about the security of American strategic planning processes. You're suggesting the Russians have intelligence about this meeting? Patterson asked, recognizing the security implications of Williams' observation. I'm suggesting they've been monitoring our response patterns and anticipated that satellite surveillance failure would pressure us into accelerated decision-making based on incomplete information, Williams replied. The goal is to observe how we make strategic decisions under pressure and time constraints, providing them with insights into our strategic thinking that could be valuable for future planning. Morrison leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of Williams' analysis that fundamentally challenged the assumptions underlying their entire approach to the crisis. Captain Williams, this represents a fundamentally different understanding of Russian intentions. If you're correct, our entire response strategy needs revision. Williams nodded, having anticipated this response and prepared recommendations based on the new strategic framework her analysis had revealed. Sir, I recommend we treat this as an intelligence-gathering operation rather than a military threat. Instead of demonstrating our capabilities, we should provide carefully controlled information that serves our strategic interests while denying the Russians the intelligence they're actually seeking. Admiral Hayes was studying Williams' analysis with intense interest, recognizing the sophistication of the strategic thinking being presented and its implications for how NATO should approach Russian activities in the future. Captain, how long have you been developing this assessment? 6 weeks, ma'am. I initially noticed anomalies in the communication patterns and began comprehensive analysis to understand what was causing the discrepancies between different intelligence sources and the apparent contradictions in Russian behavior patterns. General Patterson looked amazed at the scope of what Williams had accomplished independently, recognizing that her analysis represented the kind of comprehensive strategic assessment that typically required teams of specialists working for months. You conducted this analysis independently? Yes, sir. The pattern recognition techniques I developed during my graduate studies in systems analysis seemed applicable to understanding complex military activities when viewed as interconnected systems rather than isolated threat indicators. I had access to the same intelligence sources available to formal assessment teams, but applied different analytical methodologies. Morrison stood and walked to the displays, studying Williams' work more closely and recognizing the implications for strategic planning that extended far beyond the current crisis. Captain, This level of analysis typically requires teams of specialists and weeks of collaborative effort. You're telling me you developed this comprehensive assessment working alone? Sir, I had access to the same intelligence sources available to the formal assessment teams. The difference was analytical methodology rather than data availability. Systems analysis reveals patterns and relationships that traditional threat assessment might overlook when focused on immediate indicators rather than underlying systemic factors. The room fell into contemplative silence as the senior officers processed both Williams' analysis and the broader implications of her independent assessment capability that had identified what formal intelligence evaluation had missed despite the involvement of experienced analysts and substantial resources. Captain Williams, Morrison said finally, recognizing the significance of what had been presented, assuming your analysis is correct, what specific recommendations do you propose for responding to this situation? Williams had anticipated this question and was prepared with detailed options that addressed the new strategic framework her analysis had revealed. Sir, I recommend we conduct a controlled response designed to provide the Russians with false intelligence while gathering counterintelligence about their information-gathering capabilities and methods. We can stage deployments that appear reactive while actually testing their surveillance methods and communication interception abilities. She activated additional displays showing proposed response scenarios that demonstrated strategic thinking far beyond what anyone expected from a junior officer attending primarily as a technical specialist. Instead of genuine rapid deployment, we could conduct training exercises that simulate the responses they expect while providing misleading information about our actual capabilities and decision-making processes. General Chen studied the proposed scenarios with growing enthusiasm as he recognized the strategic potential of Williams' approach. Captain, this approach would turn their intelligence operation into our intelligence operation, allowing us to gather information about their capabilities while denying them the intelligence they're seeking. Exactly, sir. We use their reconnaissance mission as an opportunity to conduct reconnaissance of their intelligence-gathering methods while providing them with false information that serves our strategic interests. Morrison was nodding slowly as he recognized the sophisticated understanding Williams had demonstrated of strategic deception and counterintelligence operations. Captain Williams, this represents a sophisticated understanding of strategic deception and counterintelligence operations. What's your background in these areas? Williams hesitated, uncertain how to explain her unconventional preparation for this type of analysis that had not been part of her formal military training. Sir, my formal training is in systems analysis and pattern recognition, but I've been studying historical examples of military deception operations as a personal interest. The techniques used in Operation Fortitude during World War II seemed applicable to modern intelligence scenarios when adapted for current technology and strategic situations. Admiral Hayes looked impressed by the breadth of Williams' self-directed study and its application to current strategic challenges. You've been studying World War II deception operations and applying those techniques to current intelligence analysis? Yes, ma'am. The fundamental principles of providing false information while gathering real intelligence remain relevant regardless of technological changes. The methods evolve, but the strategic principles endure across different historical periods and technological environments. Morrison exchanged glances with the other senior officers, all of whom were recognizing that Williams had demonstrated analytical capabilities and strategic thinking far beyond what anyone had expected from a junior intelligence officer invited primarily to provide technical support rather than strategic guidance. Captain Williams, Morrison said formally, recognizing the significance of the moment, I'm redesigning this strategy session. Your analysis will become the foundation for our response planning. I want you to lead the assessment team developing our counterintelligence operation. Williams felt a moment of shock at the magnitude of responsibility being offered, recognizing that she was being asked to take on a role typically reserved for officers with decades more experience. Sir, I'm honored, but I should note that I've never led a strategic planning team at this level. Captain, you've just demonstrated strategic thinking that surpasses officers with decades more experience. What you haven't done is less important than what you've proven you can do in developing this analysis and presenting solutions that address the situation from a completely different perspective. General Patterson was reviewing Williams' analysis on his tablet, recognizing the implications for intelligence operations that extended far beyond the current crisis. Captain, I want to assign my senior analyst to work under your direction on this operation. Your methodology clearly produces insights that traditional approaches miss, and we need to understand how to apply these techniques more broadly. The transformation was remarkable. In the span of 30 minutes, Williams had gone from being the junior officer taking notes at the edge of the room to being recognized as the strategic architect of a complex counterintelligence operation that could fundamentally change how military intelligence evaluated Russian activities and developed responses to similar situations in the future. As the meeting continued, Williams found herself directing discussion among officers who had been making strategic decisions since before she graduated from high school. But her analysis had shifted the entire framework of the situation, and her recommendations were being implemented at the highest levels of military planning with implications that would extend far beyond the current crisis. 2 hours later, as the strategy session concluded, Morrison approached Williams privately to acknowledge what had occurred and its significance for her career and future military planning. Captain, I want you to understand what happened here today. Your independent analysis identified a sophisticated enemy operation that our formal intelligence assessment completely missed despite the involvement of experienced analysts and substantial resources. More importantly, you developed counter-strategies that turn their operation to our advantage while providing a framework for understanding and responding to similar situations in the future. Williams was still processing the day's developments and their implications for her career and the broader strategic situation. Sir, I was just applying analytical techniques that seemed appropriate to the situation. Captain Williams, what you did today will be studied in strategic analysis courses for years to come. You identified enemy intentions through pattern recognition, developed comprehensive counter-strategies that address every aspect of a complex intelligence operation, and presented solutions that transform a potential crisis into a strategic opportunity. Morrison paused, then continued with obvious respect for what Williams had accomplished. I've been making strategic decisions for 3 decades, and I've never seen analysis of this quality developed by a single officer working independently. Your approach represents a new methodology for strategic intelligence assessment that we need to understand and implement more broadly. As Williams gathered her materials and prepared to leave the briefing room, she reflected on the unexpected turn her career had taken and its implications for her future in military intelligence. She had entered the meeting as a junior intelligence officer expected to provide technical support for senior officers' strategic decisions. She was leaving as the architect of a major counterintelligence operation with responsibility for developing new approaches to strategic intelligence assessment. The transformation hadn't been the result of political maneuvering or career advancement strategies, but rather because she approached a complex problem differently than everyone else, applied analytical techniques that revealed patterns others missed, and had the courage to present conclusions that challenged conventional assessment even when doing so meant contradicting the judgments of far more senior officers. 3 days later, Williams received orders assigning her to the Joint Chiefs Strategic Analysis Division, where her pattern recognition capabilities and unconventional analytical approach would be applied to the most challenging intelligence problems facing American military leadership. The assignment represented not only a significant advancement in her career, but also recognition that her methodologies could contribute to broader strategic planning efforts. But she would always remember the afternoon when being the only woman in a room full of senior officers became an advantage rather than an obstacle, because her different perspective enabled her to see patterns and possibilities that conventional military thinking had overlooked despite decades of experience and established analytical frameworks. The captain they had invited to provide technical support had instead provided strategic leadership that transformed a potential crisis into an intelligence opportunity, demonstrating that the most valuable insights often come from the minds that approach problems differently than everyone else in the room and are willing to challenge established assumptions even in the face of skepticism from more experienced colleagues. The following weeks would prove Williams' analysis completely accurate. The Russian exercises concluded exactly as she had predicted, with their forces returning to home bases after gathering extensive intelligence about NATO response procedures and decision-making processes. More importantly, The counterintelligence operation Williams designed successfully provided the Russians with false information while revealing details about their intelligence-gathering capabilities that would prove invaluable for years to come. Her methodology would be adopted throughout the intelligence community as a standard approach for analyzing complex strategic situations, and her approach to pattern recognition in complex strategic scenarios would become required study for advanced military analysis programs. Intelligence officers would study her techniques for identifying deception operations and developing counterintelligence responses that turned enemy operations to American advantage. But the foundation of her distinguished career would always be the day when the only woman in a room full of experienced military leaders proved that fresh perspectives and unconventional thinking could transform apparent crises into strategic opportunities, earning the respect of the most senior military leadership through the power of independent analysis and innovative strategic thinking that challenged established assumptions and revealed new possibilities for strategic success. The immediate aftermath of the strategy session saw Williams working 18-hour days with a team of senior analysts who had been assigned to implement her counterintelligence operation. The irony was not lost on her that officers who had initially dismissed her presence in the briefing room were now seeking her guidance on complex strategic matters that could influence American foreign policy for decades to come. Dr. Margaret Chun, a senior intelligence analyst with 20 years of experience in Russian affairs, approached Williams during the second day of planning sessions with a mixture of professional respect and personal curiosity. "Captain Williams, I've been analyzing Russian military patterns for 2 decades, and I missed every indicator that you identified in your assessment. How did you develop the ability to see patterns that experienced analysts overlooked?" Williams looked up from the strategic planning documents that covered her temporary office desk, recognizing the genuine interest in Chen's question. "Dr. Chen, I think the difference was that I wasn't looking for threats. I was looking for patterns and relationships between seemingly unrelated activities. When you approach intelligence analysis as a systems problem rather than a threat assessment, different patterns become visible." Chen nodded thoughtfully, beginning to understand the fundamental difference in analytical approach that had produced Williams' breakthrough insights. "You're suggesting that our focus on threat identification actually blinded us to the real purpose of Russian activities." "Exactly. We were so focused on identifying military capabilities and hostile intentions that we missed the intelligence-gathering operation happening right in front of us. Sometimes the most dangerous activities are the ones that appear routine or even beneficial to our intelligence-gathering efforts." The conversation highlighted a broader challenge in military intelligence analysis that Williams' success had exposed. Traditional analytical frameworks, developed over decades of Cold War competition and refined through years of counterterrorism operations, were not always adequate for understanding the sophisticated intelligence operations conducted by peer competitors who understood American analytical methods and decision-making processes. Over the following weeks, Williams found herself at the center of a fundamental reevaluation of American intelligence analysis methods. Her approach to pattern recognition and systems thinking was being studied not just for its application to the Russian situation, but as a model for understanding complex strategic challenges that defied conventional analysis. General Morrison summoned Williams to his office 3 weeks after the initial briefing, not for routine reporting, but for a conversation that would define the trajectory of her military career. The chairman's office reflected decades of military tradition, with photographs of previous chairmen and historical artifacts that spoke to the continuity of American military leadership. "Captain Williams, sit down. We need to discuss the implications of what you've accomplished and what it means for your future in military intelligence." Morrison's tone was serious but respectful, reflecting his recognition that Williams had demonstrated capabilities that could not be ignored or minimized. Williams took the offered seat, still somewhat overwhelmed by the rapid changes in her professional status and responsibilities. "Sir, I'm honored by the opportunities I've been given, but I'm also aware that my approach challenged established methods that have served the military well for decades." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Williams with the perspective of someone who had witnessed significant changes in military affairs throughout his career. "Captain, what you've demonstrated is not a challenge to established methods, but an evolution of them. Military intelligence has always been most effective when it adapted to new challenges and incorporated new perspectives. He activated a secure tablet and showed Williams a classified assessment that had been circulating among senior intelligence leadership. Your methodology has been applied to 3 other strategic situations over the past month. In each case, analysts using your approach identified patterns that conventional analysis had missed. We're not just talking about a single success. We're talking about a new analytical framework that could transform how we understand complex strategic situations. Williams felt a mixture of pride and responsibility as she recognized the broader implications of her work. Sir, I hope the success of this approach doesn't overshadow the excellent work being done by experienced analysts using established methods. The goal should be to enhance analytical capabilities rather than replace proven techniques. Morrison nodded approvingly at Williams' diplomatic response. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that convinced me you're ready for increased responsibilities. I'm recommending you for promotion to major and assignment as Deputy Director of Strategic Analysis at the Defense Intelligence Agency. The magnitude of the opportunity took Williams' breath away. The position would make her responsible for overseeing analytical methods used throughout the intelligence community, with the authority to implement the kind of systemic changes that could improve American intelligence capabilities across multiple agencies and analytical disciplines. Sir, I'm deeply honored, but I should note that I would be the youngest officer ever appointed to that position, and I lack the extensive experience that previous deputy directors have brought to the role. Morrison smiled, recognizing the combination of ambition and humility that had characterized Williams' approach throughout the recent crisis. Captain, experience is valuable, but it can also create blind spots that prevent recognition of new possibilities. What you've demonstrated is not just analytical skill, but strategic vision that could help American intelligence adapt to challenges we haven't even recognized yet. The conversation continued for another hour, covering not just Williams' immediate assignment, but the broader implications of her analytical approach for military intelligence and strategic planning. Morrison's questions revealed that senior leadership was considering fundamental changes to intelligence analysis training and methodology based on Williams' demonstrated success. As Williams left Morrison's office, she reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in her career and its implications for her future in military service. Less than a month earlier, she had been a junior intelligence officer whose primary responsibility was providing technical support for strategic planning conducted by others. Now she was being entrusted with responsibility for shaping the analytical methods used by the entire intelligence community. The transformation represented more than personal advancement. It reflected a recognition that American military intelligence needed to evolve to meet challenges posed by sophisticated adversaries who understood traditional American analytical methods and could exploit their limitations. Williams' success had demonstrated that innovation in analytical thinking could provide strategic advantages that were as important as technological superiority or operational capabilities. 6 months later, Major Williams would publish a classified study on pattern recognition in strategic intelligence analysis that would become required reading for intelligence officers throughout the military. Her methodology would be incorporated into training programs at the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and military intelligence schools throughout the armed forces. But beyond the institutional changes and career advancement, Williams would always remember the personal lesson learned during that afternoon in the Pentagon briefing room. The experience had taught her that expertise and innovation were not mutually exclusive, and that the most valuable contributions often came from those willing to challenge established assumptions while respecting the experience and knowledge of their colleagues. The day that began with Williams sitting silently at the far end of a conference table had transformed not just her career, but the way American military intelligence approached complex strategic challenges. Her willingness to speak up when others remained silent, combined with her analytical rigor and strategic vision, had created opportunities not just for personal advancement, but for improving the nation's ability to understand and respond to sophisticated threats in an increasingly complex global security environment. The young captain who had been invited to provide technical support had instead provided strategic leadership that would influence American intelligence analysis for generations to come, demonstrating that the most important military victories are sometimes won not on battlefields, but in briefing rooms where courage, intelligence, and innovative thinking can change the course of history through the power of ideas and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom in service of national security.